Welcome back to the Activist Training Lab video course. This is the first video in a new series that we're kicking off, Recruitment and Leadership Development, and we're going to cover key skills like how to recruit people, how to retain people, how to develop leadership, how to structure teams, coaching, training, and all sorts of other really important tools. And today we're kicking off this series by talking about a spectrum of support, which is a tool you can use to analyze where your community stands on an issue and think about how to shift them and build a movement. So this is a spectrum of support, and you can see that it has some categories here arrayed in a semicircle. The movement organizers, active allies, neutrals, passive opponents, active opponents, and opposition organizers. So I'm going to define each of these terms and give an example of each one for the issue of climate justice. So let's start with movement organizers. So the movement typically refers to individual grassroots organizers or grassroots organizations who are running campaigns to address the issue and mobilize other people to join the movement. So for climate justice, this might be groups like the Climate Justice Alliance or the Sunrise Movement, or individual people hard at work fighting for climate justice. That brings us to active allies. And active allies are anybody who supports an issue and takes action to demonstrate their support. So for example, people who volunteer on climate justice campaigns, who show up to protests, who testify at city council meetings. They're the people power part of the movement for climate justice. Passive allies are people who care about or support an issue but are not taking any action. For example, a passive ally might believe climate justice is important, but they aren't acting, volunteering, or donating to contribute to the movement. Neutrals are people who don't know what they believe, aren't sure which side they're on, or just aren't even aware that the issue exists. And then past neutrals were swinging over to the other side of the spectrum to passive opponents. So this is the opposite of passive allies, people who disagree with the movement or don't support the cause but are not taking any action against it, like people who don't believe in climate change or climate action but aren't acting on that belief. Active opponents are people who take action to oppose the movement. So they're showing up to counter protests. They're calling their congressman, telling him they don't want green energy and they don't care about justice. And then finally, that brings us to the opposition. These are the people and organizations who are running campaigns and mobilizing other people against the movement. And the opposition is usually at the root of the reason the movement hasn't yet succeeded. For example, in the case of climate justice, massive fossil fuel companies and the politicians and right-wing think tanks who take fossil fuel money. And that's the spectrum of support. And you can use this tool to map out where organizations and individuals in a community stand on an issue and how many people fall into each category. And as organizers, this is useful because our goal is typically to move as many people as possible as far along the spectrum as possible. So through our organizing, we want to take people who are passive opponents or neutral and move them to become allies. We want our passive allies to become active allies, which allows us to build people power. We want to give our active allies the skills and training they need to become organizers and part of the movement. So we want to shift people further and further to our side. For the next part of this video, we're going to take a look at how a spectrum of support might shift over time. So to do that, let's pretend I'm working on a campaign, and the goal of that campaign is to get the mayor to agree to add 4 acres of wildlife habitat to the city park by 2024. So here's the spectrum of support at the beginning of this campaign. You can see there's a small movement, let's say me and 2 other people working to achieve the goal. We don't have any active allies because we haven't started organizing yet. We do have some passive allies, people we're pretty sure will support the campaign. Most people in town are neutral because they haven't even heard of, thought about, or made up their mind on this issue yet. And we expect some people to disagree, so those are our expected passive opponents, and we don't know if we'll have any active opponents or opposition. Now let's look 3 months into the future. So after 3 months of organizing, we've turned some of our passive allies and neutrals into active allies, and we've turned a lot of neutrals and passive opponents into passive allies. They're now excited about this campaign. But as the issue has gained more attention in town, we also have more passive and active opponents who think that this park project isn't a good use of city money. And a group called the Starland Citizens for Fiscal Responsibility has emerged as our opposition, and they're trying to organize more people to stop the wildlife habitat project at the park. Now let's look 6 months after the campaign launched, and at this point we win the campaign. So we successfully organized enough people that the mayor agreed to the wildlife habitat project in the park, and you can see that at the time of our victory, the movement has grown, the active allies and passive allies have grown even more, and we have more allies than opponents overall, although there are plenty of opponents left. Finally, here is a spectrum of support from 5 years after the campaign ends and after the Wildlife Habitat Project is finished. You can see that no one is really active on the issue anymore. There is no movement, no active allies, no opposition, no active opponents. All of that has dissolved, and almost everyone in town is now a passive ally. People enjoy walking and birdwatching in the new wildlife habitat area. They don't want it to be taken away. I want to draw your attention to a key concept that we saw illustrated by this example, which is polarization. And the process of polarization means that as an issue or a movement gains prominence, an increasing number of the public will choose sides, leading to growth both in the movement and in the opposition. In the example of the campaign for the Wildlife Habitat Project, you saw that we mobilized a lot of allies and we increased in support for our side, but at the same time, the campaign drew out a lot of opponents, which is the process of polarization at work. It can be really helpful when organizing to keep in mind that polarization is both normal and expected. It happens on most campaigns. One of the reasons that I like to keep this in mind is because it can be sort of discouraging when your campaign is growing and your opposition starts to come out of the woodwork, you start to get criticized, you start to see counter protests. That can be a very discouraging feeling. But knowing that polarization is normal and sort of part of the typical process of social change helps me personally stay hopeful and optimistic while I'm campaigning. So, back in 2019, I helped organize an event. It was a youth led occupation of a Washington senator's office, and we were pushing that senator to support climate justice. And this event involved middle school and high school students mostly making speeches explaining why climate change threatened their future, why they were concerned about it, and why they wanted the senator to take action. The event was actually filmed by the local media and then live streamed on Facebook and got over 10,000 views, which was phenomenal. But the unfortunate part was that about half of the commenters commented really negative things like, these kids shouldn't be skipping school for this nonsense, and these little liberal snowflakes don't know what they're talking about. And that was really tough for the youth. They, felt disheartened and discouraged. They started to question whether the occupation had been a good idea and a good tactic, and they started to question, whether our campaign could succeed if there were so many people out there kind of opposing it and not understanding what it was about. While this was a really tough moment, and I definitely wish it had not happened and these youth hadn't had to experience that, it was a good learning opportunity and a chance for all of us to discuss polarization and talk about what it can look like and how it can feel, and the fact that it is something that often happens and an expected part of campaigns, and it was a good learning moment for us. So I just share that story as an example and encourage you to keep that in mind as you're doing your own campaigns. The important thing is to focus on shifting your neutrals to passive allies to active allies, and active allies to organizers so that we build enough people power and momentum to win in spite of the opposition. That brings us to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you watch the rest of the recruitment and leadership development series, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel or visit our website for more Activist Training Lab content.